Hi, this is the Disruptive Truth Podcast, and I'm your host, Dave Sterrett, where we are challenging leaders to challenge the status quo in life and faith and business, in your relationships. And today we want to talk about philosophy. We have a special guest, Dr. Travis Dickinson. He has a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Iowa, and he teaches at Dallas Baptist University. Travis has written a book, very interesting. I'm working through it. I've read about half of it, and it's a great book. It's a big book, but it's called Logic in the Way of Jesus. So, Travis, great to have you on the show.
Well, thanks, Dave. It's great to be here.
Well, Travis, let's just jump into this.
Yeah.
Why did you write this book?
Well, I think that for me, it started for me in that my journey getting into philosophy and becoming a professor, and that whole thing for me was coming to embrace this challenge to really love God with all of my mind. So, Matthew 22:37, I know I had memorized Matthew 22:37 as a high school student, but I think I just didn't notice that part of what Jesus is telling us to do as like the most important thing for us. The greatest commandment is to love God with all of our minds. And so once that sort of clicked for me, and of course I had guys like J.P. Moreland and Dallas Willard and others who are really influential here, it was kind of all in for me. So I just dove into sort of wanting to grow just in my own intellectual journey and knowing God and loving him that way and asking the deep and difficult questions and things like that, and really seeing the benefit of logic and critical thinking, because there's things that are helpful and things that are not helpful at all. And so things like fallacies we want to stay away from, that kind of thing. So I think it just kind of came together for me, part of my intellectual journey, and wanting to sort of put that together and share that with the world in a way. This deep connection, I think, between Jesus as an intellectual, our love for God with our minds, right, and discipleship.
So this may catch some people off guard. They may
Yeah,
think, Jesus is certainly a great moral teacher and an inspiration. And with our relationship with God, it's good to have faith. But the emphasis of a logic
right.
may catch, some people off guard. They may think, well, yeah, the Stoics were brilliant and there were great intellectuals in Greece and Rome. But to put Jesus up there,
Right.
some critics may say that's a stretch, but you will argue in the first part of this book. I like this book. So the book is laid out like the first part. You kind of give this case that Jesus is an intellectual, and the profound that when these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and also the Sadducees and Pharisees are coming to Jesus
That's right.
to try to kind of trick him up and to try to kind of throw some arguments his way. He was very brilliant in his followers, like Paul was also
Yes.
brilliant in his interactions with people of the Greeks and the Romans as
Yes.
well, and the Jews. So maybe we can talk about that. What are some examples that you give that Jesus is an intellectual? Maybe you could walk us through some of those. One of the ones that I think you mentioned was maybe you could walk through just a couple of ones, but maybe you could start with this one, that one of the times the Sadducees came to Jesus
Yeah.
and they try to do this argument that there's this lady who gets married and her
Right.
husband dies, and then she marries the next one and he dies, and then she marries the next one and he dies, and you kind of wonder what she's doing to all of them, but all of them die off, and they try to trick Jesus to say, okay, you believe in the afterlife, you believe in heaven, and you believe in marriage. Well, when she goes to heaven, who's she going to be married to? So walk
Yeah.
us through the dynamics maybe of that story, and what's going on in this conversation, and how does Jesus answer in a way that is brilliant. I really like what you wrote in this.
Yeah, so part of his brilliance. So one thing that I would say that really struck me is that when you look through the gospel, people are kind of continually the reaction to Jesus is a reaction of being astonished.
Hmm.
And it really struck me how many times throughout the gospels people are just astonished. Now, of course, some of those times it's because he's doing, miracles and signs and wonders and healing folks and that kind of thing. But most of the time, that's actually more the exception. Most of the time, it's because of his teaching
Wow.
and the sort of brilliance of his presentation, brilliance of what he had to say, and that kind of thing. Um, and
I
so they're
love that
astonished.
you bring that
Yeah,
out, the word astonished.
yeah,
I mean, Luke chapter 2,
right,
you have even the first, reference of Jesus as a child,
right.
he's teaching, right?
As a kind of preteen,
Yes.
right? As a 12-year-old, Jesus is found in the temple, sitting among the sort of religious scholars, the teachers of the law, and so on, and they're astonished. And it says that he is listening and asking questions, and I just think that if that's not a picture of a critical thinker, I don't know what
Mm.
is. And then it says of these sort of religious elites that they were astonished by the answers he was giving as a 12-year, as a preteen.
Wow.
When I was a preteen, I was not too impressive, I think,
Yeah.
intellectually there, but Jesus was. And so, but yeah, so all throughout his ministry, he's like blowing minds. I mean, that's really like, if you think of like the sort of message version of, or like a contemporary version of being astonished, like he's blowing people's minds intellectually. And so you come to these, Matthew, this is also in Matthew 22, where he's being challenged. Sort of the Pharisees take turn, Sadducees take turn, and they're really pretty much silenced because Jesus refutes what they have to say, the challenge, but he does it logically. And I always point out that, Jesus could have like vaporized these guys,
True.
right? He could have
Right.
just smoked them, struck them with lightning or whatever the case may be, but he didn't. He uses logic to, kind of push back on the challenge. And so in this particular instance, Jesus is challenged with this sort of really kind of, strange thought experiment of the woman who has 7 husbands at the end, and the question is, whose husband will she be? And what it's meant to be is an absurd situation.
Yes.
So there's a form of argument we call a reductio ad absurdum, and it's where you assume something. So what the Sadducees are assuming there is that the resurrection is true. If the resurrection is true, and then they give this elaborate, thought experiment, and it's meant to end in a sort of absurdity, and the absurdity is for a woman to be married to 7 different people at once. That's meant to be absurd, and so therefore you reject the assumption that led you there, which is that the resurrection is true, or the reality. And so Jesus responds though and says, first of all, you don't understand the scriptures, right?
Right.
Which is a slap in the face to like the very
The
people
teachers of the law.
who are supposed to know the scriptures.
Right.
And he says that people will not be given in marriage in the
Mhm.
resurrection. So really problem diffused. It's already defeated, but Jesus sort of does them one better and says, and I don't remember the exact passage that he quotes, but it might be
Deuteronomy 6:4, I
is
think
it
it was.
6:4? That's what I was going to say. Is Deuteronomy 6, um, where he says that God is the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. God is a God of the living and not the dead. And so you kind of think, what point is he being made? He actually makes a very logically subtle argument that
Mm.
really turns on the tense of the verb there, because it's saying that God is the God of Abraham, God is the God of Isaac, and so on, not that God was. And so
Right.
so that scripture is saying that, given that he is currently the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, therefore these folks are still around. Like, these folks have an existence. That points to a kind of resurrection. And it's always pointed out there are other passages that they could have that Jesus could have appealed to. But when it comes to Sadducean theology, they only counted the Pentateuch as, right, the first 5 books of the Bible as, inspired scripture.
Mhm.
And Jesus knew that. So it's just the point that, and you're right, like when you look at some of the other apostles, when you look at Paul, for example, Paul just knew what was going on. He was sort of clued in intellectually. He could quote philosophers and so on in Acts 17 in order to make a very logically airtight case for Christian belief and that kind of thing. And that's where, again, like, we don't sort of think of them in that category, but when you really dig into what we're seeing in the Gospels and throughout the New Testament, I mean, it's impressive.
It's brilliant because Jesus doesn't just immediately call out their fallacy.
Yeah.
He begins by finding some common ground, and
Yeah.
I'll turn my phone off there.
Yeah,
But
you're
he
okay.
begins by finding some common ground, and I think
Yeah.
maybe there's some example for us to do that, or he references something that they believe is authority.
Right.
And so I love it that he cites from Deuteronomy that they would hold in high esteem rather than Daniel or someone else that they may not believe is authority. And maybe there's an example for us. And, my full-time job is in medical sales. And when I'm communicating with doctors or even just in life, there's a lot of information in our world and with our listeners. And I think maybe there's an example that, whenever we're trying to bring up an idea that someone may not believe in, is there's something of good to maybe start with some common ground.
Yeah.
And remind that person, if they believe in this principle. And it was something that in this case, the Sadducees held in very high esteem and high view. And I love, you brought up a lot of examples in this book that, maybe I had read in the Bible. I mean, I'm sure I had read them in the Bible before. But you just brought new light into them in a way. And so let's just walk through this. So this is the book. I highly recommend our audience to get it, A Logic in the Way of Jesus. And it's really going to be good. Like for our audience who, like for 2 years, before I was in medical sales, I taught for 7 years, and I taught at a Christian school, Prestonwood Christian Academy. And I would highly recommend this book for high school students, for anywhere 9th through 12th grade, but also college. And it's rigorous. So even grad students at a seminary could really benefit through this, and professionals as well. So who did you write this book for? Is it for academics, or is it for everybody? Or tell us a little bit about who you wrote this book for.
Yeah. So I wrote it as accessibly as I can, could have. I think so. It presupposes really no academic background even. And I spent a lot of time, as you've sort of pointed out, trying to motivate the study for Christians, because again, as Christians, sometimes we, sort of avoid intellectual pursuits precisely because we're people of faith, and we think that faith is something different from all this. But I think what I try to argue is that faith and reason, reason complements faith and helps us to have even greater faith and that sort of thing. And so it's motivated for somebody that just has never had any kind of formal class with this, and then just walk through it real kind of slowly. So yeah, I think for any person that hasn't had exposure to a kind of academic class or training in this area, it's going to be written right where they're at. At least that's the hope.
Yes, and some of these chapters will be a little bit challenging. Maybe we could jump into that.
Yeah.
Just broadly speaking, the first part you deal more with formal logic, and you talk about deductive logic, and then you go into some of the informal fallacies. Maybe just briefly, I'll throw out some terms there, and you can kind of walk us through that. What's the distinction between formal and informal when it's applied to logic, but also to fallacies?
Yeah. So really just formal versus informal, what that means is formal would be where we put it in a sort of logical form. So you'll see it as premise 1, premise 2, conclusion typically. Sometimes we call that syllogistic form.
Yes.
That's all formal really means. But what the sort of arguments that we can do that with best is what we call arguments that pass us what we call deductive standards of logic. So what that just sounds like, that's a fancy way to say that the premises of that argument entail the conclusion.
Okay, so let's just pause right there.
Yeah.
let's just, for our audience, maybe they took logic way back. We have
Yep.
engineers listening and so forth like that, but we also have, people in sales, and it's like, it's been forever since I took
Yeah, yeah.
logic.
Sure.
Walk us through some just basics of introductory logic that you share in this book, and maybe some basic rules at
Yeah.
the most basic level.
Yeah. So, um, probably the most basic rule when it comes to these formal arguments, or what we call arguments that pass a deductive standard, it would be an argument that's valid. And that just means the premises, again, entail the conclusion. And all that means is that if those premises are true, then it guarantees the conclusion. Right? It's
Yes.
sort of the best kind of argument we would hope to come by, because if those premises are true, then right, again, there's no logically possible way in which the conclusion's not also true.
Mhm.
But a lot of our arguments aren't like that, because right, we don't sort of have guarantees like that in life.
Mhm.
So we move to informal arguments, and informal arguments are going to be ones that pass what I call non-deductive standards. And this is where, at best, when they're good arguments, they don't guarantee the conclusion, but they just make the conclusion likely. I say just make. I mean, that's a pretty good thing. Like when you've got premises that give you really good reason to believe the conclusion, even if not guarantee. So that's kind of the basic distinction, the basic kind of way in which you're going to think about formal, informal, two different kinds of arguments. You're going to have deductively valid arguments where the premises entail the conclusion, and you're going to have informal arguments or non-deductively good arguments where those premises just make that conclusion likely.
Okay, there's misconceptions, that about Christians and some of the arguments for the existence of God, and there may be some bad, legitimate bad things that have been said, but there's also arguments. Maybe just for the sake of the audience, you could give us an example of a deductive argument
Yeah.
for the existence of God.
Yeah. So the sort of easiest one to just pull out here would be, I think, the design argument. And this is a deductively valid argument. And it says, if there's design in the universe, then there is a designer. Premise two is there is design in the universe, therefore there is a designer. That's a conclusion. And
Yes,
what we notice about that is that if those premises are true, then that conclusion has to be true. You can't deny one of the. I'm sorry, you can't deny the conclusion without denying one of the premises there.
very good. I like your section. You list out an example of, you know, for example, informal fallacies. That's
Yeah,
often fun to listen to. Tell us some of the examples in everyday conversations. The conversation turns to God or politics. They're very common, informal fallacy.
yeah.
Well, tell you what, before we get there to informal, tell us some of the most common, some of the most basic um, fallacies in formal logic.
Okay.
Okay,
So
so let's start there before we get into
yeah. So a formal fallacy is one, again, that it's sort of in the form of the argument, the structure of the argument where there's the fallacy. And the ones that we talk about typically are ones that, again, they sort of look like they're right, but th're not really. And so one would be, for example, the what's called affirming the consequent.
Yes.
And so this one would be, to use the design argument again, if there's design in the universe, then there's a designer. But then premise two would be to say that there is a designer, where we're affirming that consequent, that
Mhm.
second part of that first premise, and thereby saying, therefore, there's design in the universe. Right? That doesn't actually follow, because it could be the case that you have a designer that didn't choose to design any part of the universe or something like that.
Yes.
So it's really just an invalid argument, but it's one that sort of has a form that we can talk about and think about. It's where the premises don't actually entail the conclusion.
Very good. So affirming the consequent. Um, okay, let's move on to informal. You give
Okay.
25 common
Yeah.
informal fallacies. Uh, these are kind of fun. Most jokes are often informal fallacies.
Right.
Um, but in argument, it's good for us to be aware of these, make sure that we don't
Yeah.
use them, and unless we're trying to use humor or something
Yeah.
like that. So,
Yeah. So one of my favorite fallacies is the gambler's fallacy.
okay, what's this one?
So the gambler's fallacy is where I don't know if I mean, I think it does happen. I was gonna say it doesn't happen, but I think it probably does. It's maybe not very consequential, but unless there's a lot of money on the line when you're gambling. But it's where you have, let's say, been dealt. Right, I'm Baptist, so I've never played poker, of course, before, but
Just
I've
try
heard
it.
of it. I've heard of it, but no, I'm kidding. But right, so say you get like 3 or 4 bad hands in a row,
Mhm.
and you think, you know what, on this fifth hand, because I've gotten such bad hands, this fifth hand is I'm just due for a good one.
Okay.
But that's fallacious, because every time the cards go back in, it's the same probability that you're going to get a good or bad hand as you were when you didn't have one. It might be a little easier with a coin flip. So
Yes.
say you're flipping a coin and you get 4 heads in a row, and you think, chances are probably the probability is high that I'm going to get a tails on the fifth one. But it's not. It's just 50-50.
Still
Even on the
50/50.
fifth one, doesn't matter what the previous ones are. So the gambler's fallacy is thinking that independent events are actually related to prior events when they're not.
So, okay,
That's
so
what I
this is
fallacy.
very, very good. I just had a work trip in Vegas. I didn't gamble, but just listening to the stories last week of my coworkers who would win $1,000 the night
Right.
before and then lose money.
Right.
You're right. In life, we just had the Final Four. This is, something that people
Yeah.
believe in. How does this play out in faith, though? How does this, with faith, or whether someone's leaning towards atheism or they're leaning towards Christianity? What would be an example? Can you think of any examples or ways that maybe Christians use this, or maybe ways atheists or other faiths use
Yeah.
the fallacy?
I don't know if that's why I say, like, I mean, there probably is an idea where people have kind of a rough go in life, and
Okay.
they think, my time's just going to have to come soon. It's got to be
Yeah.
coming soon. I'm going to get a better hand in life. Um, and again, the fallacy is thinking that independent events are actually related in some way, so
Right.
that you're raising the probability of getting something better coming along. And again, sometimes in life that's true, but I think that other times, somebody gets their car breaks down, get a bad diagnosis at the doctor's office, they lose some money in some place and get fired from their job, and they think, man, it's just something's got to turn around sometime
Right.
soon. I think that would probably be an instance. And again, you could imagine probably a sort of prosperity gospel,
Right.
maybe, way of thinking that would be the gambler's fallacy. But
So maybe if someone is listening to this and they've gone through a horrible time,
yeah,
it's a country song. They've lost their dog, or maybe, all joking aside, they've lost a loved one, or
yeah,
it's thing after thing. Their hope in that situation, the fallacy would be thinking kind of this: because I've experienced all this bad, I'm due for something better.
almost like a karma kind of idea.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm just due for favor. I'm due
yeah,
because I've endured all these things. Rather, in that situation, saying, you know what, I'm trusting God because He's good.
yeah,
He is powerful. He loves me. He has the power to heal. And we're praying, we're trusting in Him that He's going to help me. And I'm working hard to get a job in this situation. And maybe it's a positive assumption, not because I was rejected because of the
right.
past times, but because I'm working hard and I'm throwing out a lot of seed and I'm fishing a
Yeah,
lot. And because of the abundance, statistically, with me working hard and also praying, my chances are better in the
yeah,
future. So maybe
yeah,
more of a positive view that one should take. But you're
right.
right. In everyday life, sometimes people bring up the kind of these karma or new age thoughts
Yeah,
that really aren't Christian at all.
yeah,
you bring up some other ones, like often ad hominem. We see this all
Yes.
the time,
Yes.
that we, attack the person rather than their argument.
Right.
In politics,
Right.
you attack
Oh
one
man.
candidate all the time, and
Yeah.
sometimes we watch it as entertaining, but we need to be careful with this when we're talking to someone who doesn't believe the way we do. We
Yeah,
don't
that's right.
assume something just because of their uh, faith or non-faith as
Yeah.
well. So this book is great. It's a textbook. I would recommend, if you're a homeschool parent, this is a
Hmm.
great resource. If you teach college students an introductory course in logic at a Christian university or maybe a classical university, I think this book will give a good combination of both the purpose, why as Christians we should engage in this command to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Dr. Travis Dickinson makes the case that we need to do this. And then it's like a textbook as well, full of examples, categorical logic, a science and inference to the best explanation. He talks about fallacies, evidence, a great book, also intellectual virtues, the art of persuasion. You appeal to Jesus, you appeal to the philosophers. Travis, great book. Any other closing thoughts? Where should people buy this book?
It's really everywhere. It's Amazon, and of course, Lifeway is connected with the publisher, and so you can definitely get it there as well. And we've got a supplementary site as well with answers to the practice problems that are in it. So and then we're in the works of developing that further. So we're going to have more practice helps and supplemental material on the website there. So that'll be through Lifeway.
Excellent. Well, Travis, thank you so much. It's been great having you.
Yeah,
Any
man.
other thoughts for maybe someone that's out there who's they want to be a philosopher. They want to be like you, teaching at a university. I know it's hard. I have some friends who have their PhDs in philosophy and they can't seem to get jobs, but it can be very rewarding. What would you say to a person who is a Christian and they want to be a philosopher? Any practical advice that you might give to
Yeah,
that person?
some of the best. I don't know if anybody told me this or if I just sort of stumbled on it myself. Is just take it one step at a time and
Mm,
be faithful to the step that you're in. And so for me, because it's a long, hard road to go from through graduate work all the way to land a job is a long, hard road. And it's not quite like getting to the NBA. I'm sure that's way harder, but it's not easy. I'll just say
yeah.
that. But I would just say be faithful, and I think that's true for everybody, no matter what stage they're at. um, the call of the book in a lot of ways is that we would just love God with our minds and just grow wherever we're at. So that doesn't have to mean academics. It's certainly not. I think I say in the book that I'm not trying to, sort of call people to go back to school as the only way to fulfill the command to love God with our minds. Some of the most brilliant people I know would just say that they are not cut out for a classroom.
Yeah.
And I think it's, I have a heart for those sorts of guys too. And they read, they work on stuff, they think about things, and this book is for them as well, I would hope. And I certainly think that this task of growing in our faith and loving God with our minds is for them. So it's for all of us as Christians. It's really right. Jesus didn't just say for the professors and pastors, it's for all of us. The most important thing is to love God with all of our hearts, souls, and also our minds.
Great word. Thank you so much, Travis, for joining Disruptive Truth for this podcast. And we wish you much success. And I hope many people, both those in academics and also working professionals,
Yeah.
homeschool moms, parents, get this book to equip ourselves and our children how to think logically. Thank you, Travis.
You bet. Thanks, Dave.